Hello again. I've mentioned this before, but it needs to be restated time and again. Emergency legislation has an awful habit of lingering on long after the emergency itself has passed. This happens in other countries. The British are particularly prone to it, letting emergency legislation hang around for decades or centuries. I'm old enough to remember a number of examples of this, and with the government now changing the law practically every day without even bothering with debating it in Parliament, I thought it might be wholesome to recall one particular instance of how this process works and how long the effects of the supposed emergency can last. Just to remind viewers, at the moment, the British government is passing laws and altering laws so that they can break up peaceful demonstrations by force on the grounds of public health. We saw this in Trafalgar Square on Saturday, with peaceful protesters being baton charged simply because they were standing in the square expressing their opinions about the government and the law. They did this because under the 1984 Public Health Act, believe it or not, the government can order things like that to happen. It's recently been amended to prevent political gatherings and so on. In other words, 36 years ago, a law was passed, and it has now been retroactively changed to forbid legitimate political activity, all without any debate in Parliament at all. Anyway, let's look at what can happen when you start playing this game. On August 8, 1914, 4 days after Britain declared war on Germany, signalling the start of the First World War, the Defence of the Realm Act was passed. Without any debate in Parliament, of course, as is often the case with these emergencies. It laid down all sorts of powers for the government and could be changed and added to at any time. Essentially, it gave Asquith's government unlimited power over the population. It became illegal for a civilian to buy a pair of binoculars, and when rationing came into force, a bit was added making it illegal to put out bread for birds. Another amendment made it illegal to whistle in the street in case anybody mistook your whistling for an air raid warning. It was even altered to deal with the possibility of somebody supplying cocaine to actresses. There was concern about the production of munitions later in the war, and the Defence of the Realm Act, or DORA, as it was popularly known, was added to once more to stop people sitting around in pubs all day and possibly turning up drunk for their shift in an armaments factory. This was Lloyd George's doing. David Lloyd George was a temperance man. He was very down on drink, and he thought that the First World War was a good opportunity to put a stop to drinking. Anyway, if he could, he would have introduced total prohibition, as happened in America with the Volstead Act. But other members of the government didn't agree. They were a little bit too fond of drinking themselves. So the most that Lloyd George could get through was provisions for limiting the opening hours of pubs. It became a legal obligation for public houses to close for a few hours during the afternoon and then to close again at certain hours of the night so that factory workers could get a good night's sleep. Before this time, pubs could open at 5 in the morning if they wished to do so and stay open without interruption until midnight. The British had some of the most liberal licensing laws in the world at the beginning of 1914. Anyway, now the opening hours of pubs were strictly controlled and everybody had to leave the pub for 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon so they could sober up a bit. It was clearly understood, or it was people were given to understand, that this was an emergency measure to deal with the crisis of a world war, and that once peace came, everything would return to normal, and men would once again be free to lounge around in the pub all day long if they felt like it. We come now to the point which might astonish some people. In fact, it will probably astonish anybody under the age of 50. It's hugely relevant to the recent imposition of a 10 o'clock closing time for pubs, which is being done apparently for reasons of public health. As a young man, I drank regularly in public houses, and all of them were still obliged by law at that time to close at 3 in the afternoon and to stay closed for 2 or 3 hours. This afternoon closing, together with what most of us in the 1970s and 1980s saw as the traditional closing time of 10:30 during the week, was a background which drinkers simply took for granted. We didn't question it. Incredibly, the restrictions imposed by the Defence of the Realm Act during the First World War were still in force 60, 70 years after the end of that war. The legal duty to close pubs in the afternoon was not abolished until 1988, 70 years after the end of the First World War. I mention all this because we are now getting used to some other temporary restrictions on our liberty, and when I say temporary, you can imagine I put the word in quotation marks, because you're a mug if you think that once this supposed crisis is over, all those limitations on what we can do will just fade away. They won't. A very neat little trick is being played here, one which reminds me a little bit of the 3-card trick, which some of you might have seen in the street. The Coronavirus Act, which was introduced this year, is hedged about with what are known as sunset provisions, which means that it will automatically lapse if it's not renewed by Parliament. Of course it will be renewed, but even if it were not and it vanished from the statute books, that wouldn't help matters. It would make no difference at all, because some of the most draconian measures have been taken not under the Coronavirus Act, but by passing amendments to the 1984 Public Health Act, and this doesn't have to go through Parliament. The government can continue to do this at any time because they've found that people will put up with it, not object to decrees being enforced by retroactively changing the law. Just to make things plain, what's happened is that a law was passed in 1984, and the government now, without reference to anybody at all, are changing that law. So they're changing a law that was made almost 40 years ago, and that's the basis for a lot of the restrictions under which we're now living. Once the government has discovered that nobody will object to their liberty being curtailed in this way, and political protests being forbidden, curfews imposed and so on, they'll put up with it, then the government will simply carry on doing it habitually. We are seeing some of our oldest freedoms being thrown away, and only a tiny handful of people have sounded the alarm. This is, to say the least of it, a very bad sign.